I never thought a rented tux could sting. It wasn't the cut of it, though the lapels looked tired, and the sleeves pinched me at the wrist. It wasn't the shoes either, stiff and borrowed from a church thrift store where I spend most Saturdays fixing old chairs. No, the sting came from the look on my daughter's face. She was standing in the living room, curls pinned, her dress the color of midnight sky. She looked beautiful. Not beautiful the way strangers say a girl is pretty, but the kind of beauty that belongs to a moment, a season in life. The kind you want to freeze forever. And I, foolish old me, wanted a picture. "Sweetheart," I said, lifting the camera, "just one shot, by the door maybe. You'll want to remember this someday." Her lips pressed into a line. Her friends were waiting outside, the car idling, laughter spilling in through the window. She shifted her purse higher on her shoulder and didn't meet my eyes. "Dad," she whispered, urgent and sharp, "please don't, you'll embarrass me." The words were quiet, but they hit like a slammed door. I lowered the camera. Embarrass. I've been called many things in life: a hard worker, a handyman, sometimes the guy who never left this town. But never, not once, did I think I'd be called an embarrassment by the girl I gave my everything for. She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw it in her eyes, the way my jacket sagged on my shoulders, the way my tie didn't sit quite right, the way the cuffs were frayed. She saw not a father eager for a memory, but a man out of place. And she winced. "Please, Dad, just don't tonight." Her friends honked the horn outside. She leaned in, brushed my cheek with the faintest kiss, habit more than affection, and hurried away. The screen door clicked shut. I stood there in the silence, camera heavy in my hand, the flashbulb staring at me like an unblinking eye. I wish I could tell you I shrugged it off, that I laughed and said, "Teenagers." But the truth is, the words burrowed deep. All those years of late shifts, of dinners eaten from a lunch pail, of patching shoes so she could have new ones, suddenly they seemed invisible. What she saw tonight wasn't sacrifice or love or devotion. What she saw was a man in a cheap tuxedo who didn't belong. I sank onto the couch and stared at the carpet. It was worn in the spot where her little feet once landed when she ran to me after school. "Daddy!" She'd cry and leap into my arms. She didn't care then if my shirt smelled of sweat or my hands were rough. Back then I was her hero. When did that change? Maybe it's the way the world tells kids that parents should be polished, perfect, dressed like the people on magazine covers. Maybe it's just what growing up does, shaves away the shine of childhood, leaves behind the awkwardness of adolescence. But sitting there, I felt something heavier than disappointment. I felt replaceable. Later, I drove her to the school. The ride was quiet. She tapped at her phone, texting, her face lit by the glow of the screen. I kept my eyes on the road, the wipers swishing away the light spring rain. I wanted to say something, to remind her that nights like this come only once, that fathers don't last forever, that the tuxedo might be borrowed, but my love was not. But the words stayed lodged in my throat. When we pulled up, she opened the door quickly, barely turning. "Thanks, Dad." Then she was gone, swallowed by the cluster of gowns and corsages, sequins sparkling under the floodlights. Music thudded from the gymnasium, distant but insistent like a heartbeat. I stayed in the car a while, listening to the rain. I thought about how she'd remember this night. Would she remember the dance, the songs, the laughter of her friends? Or would she remember the way she looked at her father, ashamed? And then, somewhere in that silence, a thought came. If this was the night she wanted to forget me, maybe I could give her the night she'd never forget. Not with a camera, not with a tuxedo, but with something bigger, something lasting. I gripped the steering wheel, a plan forming, half mad and half sacred. She thought I embarrassed her tonight. Maybe tomorrow she would see. Maybe tomorrow she would understand. The rain followed me home. It pattered on the windshield as I drove, and it pattered on the tin roof of our house long after I'd set the car in park. I left the tuxedo jacket on the back of a chair and sat for a while in my undershirt, listening. There is something about rain at night. It blurs the edges of things, makes you feel smaller, makes time feel softer. I wanted to stop thinking about her words. I wanted to tell myself they were nothing more than a teenager's careless tongue. But they weren't just words. They carried the weight of distance, a distance I hadn't noticed until it opened like a canyon between us. I looked at the old photo album on the shelf. She used to love flipping through it. There was a picture of her in second grade, front tooth missing, clutching a science fair ribbon. She'd begged me to stand in the photo, my arm around her shoulder. My shirt was dirty from work, my jeans stained, but she'd beamed with pride. "This is my dad," she'd announced, as though that explained the whole world. And now I was someone to hide. The thought cracked something in me. But beneath the crack, a strange determination stirred. I've never been a rich man. The numbers in my bank account come and go like birds at a feeder, here one week, gone the next. But what I've always had is grit. I was raised in a house where love was measured not in dollars but in effort. A man who loves his child finds a way. And so I asked myself, if she wouldn't let me stand in her picture, could I build her a memory instead? A memory so strong, so luminous, that it would outshine the embarrassment of tonight. The idea took root, wild and improbable, but once it was planted, I couldn't let it go. I walked into the garage, the smell of sawdust and oil still heavy in the air. Tools hung on the wall, some older than I was. I touched the handle of a hammer, then set it down. This wasn't a job for nails and boards. This was something else, something bigger. I picked up the phone. The first call I made was to an old friend, Marty, who ran a catering truck. We hadn't spoken much since his divorce, but he owed me a favor or two from back when I helped him rewire his kitchen. "Marty," I said, "you busy tonight?" "Depends, you offering to fix my sink again?" He laughed. "Not tonight, I need food, something simple, something that can feed a lot of hungry teenagers." There was a pause on the line. "Teenagers, at this hour? You're not telling me you're opening a soup kitchen at midnight, are you?" I explained, haltingly, about the prom, about the look in my daughter's eyes, about the hole it left in me. I expected him to laugh, maybe even say I was crazy. Instead, he said, "I'll be there in an hour, got a van full of supplies anyway." That was the first yes, and once you get one yes, others follow. I called Mrs. Lang from down the street, the retired florist who used to let my daughter pluck daisies from her garden. I asked if she had any leftover flowers, anything to brighten a table. She sighed, the kind of sigh that carries decades of wisdom, and told me she'd make a few arrangements for the girl who used to braid crowns out of clover. Then I called Benny, a local handyman, the kind of fellow who could string lights between trees without blinking. He chuckled when I told him what I had in mind. "Sounds like the craziest plan I've ever heard," he said. "I'm in." Piece by piece, it began to take shape. The old baseball field at the edge of town had been abandoned for years. The bleachers sagged, the grass grew wild, but the space was open and flat. With a few lanterns, a string of borrowed lights, some flowers, and Marty's truck, it could be transformed into something magical, something better than a prom inside a gymnasium. By midnight, I was standing on that field, mud clinging to my shoes, heart beating faster than it should for a man my age. Benny was already there, up on a ladder, stringing bulbs that glowed against the damp night. Marty's truck hummed, the smell of sizzling food drifting across the grass. Mrs. Lang's flowers sat in mason jars, simple but elegant. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I closed my eyes for a moment. I could almost hear the music that wasn't playing yet, the laughter that hadn't arrived, the clatter of shoes against the makeshift dance floor we hadn't even laid. And I thought of my daughter, of her voice, sharp with shame, telling me not to embarrass her. I whispered into the night as though she could hear me. "Someday, kiddo, you'll understand. Someday you'll see this wasn't about pride. It was about love, and love doesn't care what it costs." The rain had stopped. A thin slice of moon hung above the field, pale and watching. I stood there, jacketless, damp, foolish, and yet for the first time that evening I felt like a father again. By morning the field still smelled faintly of fried onions and damp earth. I had slept little, my mind busy stitching together details the way a tailor patches an old coat, never perfect but good enough to wear. The trouble was money. I walked through my kitchen, the same linoleum underfoot I'd laid 20 years ago, and opened the drawer where I kept my bills. They stared back at me like unsmiling judges. Utility, car insurance, medical statement. The ink seemed darker that morning, the numbers sharper. I spread them out on the table, one beside the other, and pulled a notebook toward me. My pen scratched against the paper as I added figures, crossed them out, added again. No matter how I arranged the math, it ended the same. I didn't have enough. The lights Benny strung, the flowers Mrs. Lang arranged, the food Marty cooked, they'd given me kindness for free. But kindness doesn't stretch to everything. There were chairs to rent, speakers for music, maybe a tent in case the rain returned. Teenagers might not notice the details, but my daughter would. She would see if it felt second-rate. She would see if it felt like a man patching something together because he couldn't afford better. And hadn't that been the very thing she was ashamed of? I closed the notebook and sat with my hands pressed to my forehead. Pride and poverty make poor neighbors, but they live side by side in men like me. I wanted to give her something beautiful, yet the numbers told me beauty came with a price I couldn't pay. Still, a father finds a way. At the bank that afternoon, I wore my one decent shirt buttoned to the collar. The teller, a woman with silver glasses, looked at me over the counter. "Loan officer," I asked quietly, as if the word itself were shameful. She pointed me to a cubicle where a young man in a bright tie tapped at a computer. He smiled too wide, the way people do when they know you don't belong in a place like this. "What can we do for you, Mr. Flores?" he asked. I told him. A personal loan, small, just enough to cover a one-night event. I didn't tell him it was a prom after prom, stitched together by hope and desperation. I just said it was for family needs. He nodded, clicking his keyboard. "Employment." I gave him the name of the shop where I still picked up handyman work, odd hours fixing roofs, repairing gutters, whatever paid. "Collateral." I slid across the paperwork from my truck, the one thing of value I owned outright. It wasn't much, rust ate at the sides, but it still ran. He studied it, then leaned back. "We can approve this," he said at last, "though the interest is a little steep." Steep, such a polite word for expensive, but I nodded anyway. Because how do you measure interest against the face of your daughter, against the memory she might carry for the rest of her life? I signed. My hand trembled, but the ink flowed steady. That night I returned to the field with a receipt for rented chairs and a promise that speakers would arrive by Saturday. The place already looked different. Strings of light draped from pole to pole, the bulbs glowing faintly as Benny tested the wiring. The air carried the sweet scent of Mrs. Lang's flowers, newly delivered, lined up in jars waiting for tables. I set down the receipts on a folding chair and looked around. It wasn't just a field anymore, it was becoming a vision. Marty waved from the truck, spatula in hand. "Got burgers for the kids," he called. I raised my thumb in thanks. He winked. Benny climbed down the ladder, his palms black with dirt. "You really going through with this?" "I signed for it today," I said, my voice lower than I intended. He didn't ask how much. Friends know when not to ask. He just patted my shoulder and went back to work. Later, when the others left, I stayed. The bulbs cast a soft glow over the grass. The folding chairs stood in rows like silent witnesses. The night air was cool, and the stars, when the clouds parted, shone faint and uncertain, as if even they wondered what I was doing. I walked to the center of the field and imagined her there. My daughter in that midnight blue dress, turning under the lights, her friends cheering. Not ashamed, not hiding me. Just living in the kind of moment she'd remember when she was older, maybe even when she had children of her own. I whispered into the open sky, "This is yours, kiddo, even if it costs me everything." And in that whisper was a prayer that the price I'd just promised the bank would buy me more than chairs and music, that it would buy me back a piece of her trust. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the faint smell of earth, and I thought of all the fathers who came before me, men who worked too many hours, who gave too much, who carried too little recognition, men who stood on the edge of their children's lives, hoping to be invited in. I thought of them, and I thought of her, and I knew I would not stop now. The field was ready to bloom, and I had planted my seed in it. Tomorrow it would grow. The days that followed moved with a kind of nervous rhythm, as if the whole town had joined in a secret I was only beginning to understand. The field stood waiting, the lights strung and the flowers placed. But what good was a stage without an audience? What good was music without dancers? I realized then that this gift for my daughter could not be built with wood and wires alone. It needed people, her people. The ones she laughed with at lunch, the ones who whispered secrets in hallways, the ones who had been in that car the night she told me not to take her picture. The trouble was, I didn't know them. Not really. I had seen their faces in the rearview mirror, had heard their voices spill out in giggles on the porch, but they were strangers, orbiting my daughter in a world that felt close to me. So I began the way any father without an invitation does, quietly, carefully asking around. The first to help was Mrs. Lang. She was trimming the last of her roses when I stopped by. I told her in vague terms that the field was ready, but it needed life. "These kids," I said, "they need to know there's another place to be after that gym floor grows tired." She tilted her head the way older women do when they see through your words to the heart of them. "You want them to come," she said simply. I nodded. She pointed across the street. "Talk to my grandson. He's in her grade, plays trumpet in the band. If he spreads the word, it'll reach who it needs to reach." That night, I found myself sitting on her porch with a lanky boy named Aaron. His hair fell into his eyes, and he kept shifting his trumpet case from knee to knee. "You're her dad, right?" he asked. "Yes," I said, though the word felt heavier than usual. He squinted at me as if searching for a reason to trust. I told him what I could, that I wanted the kids to have a place after prom, something different, something unforgettable. I didn't say how much it cost me or how much it mattered. I just said I wanted to see them smile. He studied me a moment longer, then grinned. "I'll tell them, don't worry, kids talk." And just like that, the seed was planted. The next evening, I drove past the diner where the cheerleaders gathered after practice. I felt foolish walking in, a man in work boots among glittering uniforms. But I found the courage to approach one of them, a girl whose name I remembered from hearing it shouted across our kitchen when my daughter was on the phone. She looked at me curiously as I explained. Her eyes softened when I said the words, "A dance under the stars." Maybe it was the way I said it, or maybe teenagers carry a hunger for magic even when they pretend not to. She nodded and promised to spread the word. Piece by piece, the whisper grew. At the field, preparations thickened. Benny rigged a small stage from plywood. Marty tested a speaker, the bass thumping low across the grass. Mrs. Lang tied ribbons to the chairs, her hands steady despite their age. And each night I sat on the bleachers and listened to the town breathe around me. Somewhere in that rhythm, I heard possibility. Still, doubt crept in. What if no one came? What if the kids laughed at the idea of an old man's party patched together with borrowed lights and jars of flowers? Worse, what if my daughter felt more shame, not less? I carried those questions like stones in my pockets, but I carried them anyway. On Friday afternoon, I stopped at the grocery store to pick up paper cups and soda. At the register, the clerk, a girl no older than my daughter, glanced at the pile. "Big party?" she asked. "Something like that," I answered. She smirked knowingly. "We heard about it, the field, the lights, sounds better than the gym." Her words startled me. The whisper had spread farther than I thought. My ears burned, my chest tightened. For the first time, I believed it might actually happen. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow in the dark. I thought about my daughter again, about the way she hadn't looked me in the eye that night in the living room. I wondered if she knew what was coming, if she could feel the tide shifting around her. I prayed, silently, that when she stepped onto that field, she would see me differently, not as a man in a worn tuxedo, but as the father who loved her enough to risk everything. The hum of the fan blended with the sound of the crickets outside, and for the first time all week, I let myself fall asleep with something close to hope. Saturday evening arrived like a held breath. All day clouds had stretched across the sky, thick and uncertain, as if deciding whether to bless or betray me. I walked the field, tightening ropes, checking the bulbs one last time. The chairs stood in neat rows, their white paint catching the low sun. Marty's truck hummed in the corner, the smell of frying meat drifting over the grass. Benny had even borrowed a small generator, its steady rumble reassuring, a heartbeat beneath the quiet. The world was ready, but I wasn't sure if they were coming. The silence of an empty party is a cruel silence. Every light bulb feels wasted, every ribbon mocked. I tried not to imagine it, that field glowing with no one to see it, my effort vanishing into the night air. Still, the fear pressed hard against my ribs. I checked my watch. 7:45. Prom should be in full swing across town by now, the gymnasium crowded, the DJ blasting recycled hits. My daughter would be there, swirling in that midnight dress, maybe laughing with friends, maybe not thinking of me at all. And then headlights appeared at the edge of the field. A car crept down the dirt path, tires crunching gravel, my breath caught. When the doors opened, 3 kids spilled out, 2 boys in ill-fitting tuxes and a girl in a pink gown. They looked around, puzzled, as though stepping into a secret. "You heard?" I asked, my voice too soft. The taller boy grinned. "Aaron told us, said this was where the real party'd be." I swallowed, relief warming me like whiskey. "You're early," I said, trying to sound casual. "Better early than stuck in the gym," the girl replied, tugging at her heels. "This is, wow, did you do all this?" I nodded, my hands fidgeted, tugging at the hem of my shirt. "It's amazing," she said, and for the first time that week I let myself believe. More cars came, a pair of headlights then another, until the field glowed not just from the bulbs but from the steady stream of teenagers climbing out, dresses shimmering, jackets flapping in the breeze. Some carried sodas, others dragged coolers from their trunks. They looked around with wide eyes, whispering to each other, the way people do when they stumble into something unexpected and wonderful. I stood by the edge, shaking hands, offering nods, not quite part of them but not a part either. They didn't treat me like an intruder. If anything, they seemed to welcome the idea that an adult had carved out a space just for them, a space without chaperones or rules shouted through microphones. The music started low, a crackle from the speakers, then a song spilling across the grass. It wasn't perfect. The bass rattled, the treble hissed. But when the first couple began to sway beneath the lights, none of that mattered. I kept searching the arrivals for her. Each car that slowed, each door that opened. I held my breath, and each time it wasn't her, my chest fell a little. But I reminded myself, she didn't know, not yet. The night had to run its course first, the gym had to tire, the chatter had to find its way here. Meanwhile, her friends were already arriving. I recognized faces from the photographs taped on her mirror, the ones she'd taken in photo booths or at football games. They called out greetings, some with surprise, some with gratitude. "This is awesome, Mr. Flores," one shouted. My name in their mouths felt strange but good, like a door cracking open. Benny clapped me on the back. "Look at this," he said, sweeping his arm across the growing crowd. "It's working." I nodded, unable to speak. The sight was enough. Teenagers dancing on grass instead of a polished gym floor, laughter spilling into the night, the field alive in a way it hadn't been in years. At one point, I stepped back toward the bleachers and sat, letting the music wash over me. I thought of the papers I'd signed at the bank, the promises I'd made with money I didn't have. The cost was real, the weight heavy. But in that moment, watching these kids spin beneath the strings of light, I wondered if maybe some debts weren't measured in dollars. Maybe some debts were paid in joy. The generator hummed steady. The night air smelled of grass and food and perfume. A group of boys raced across the field, jackets flying, while girls cheered from the sidelines. Somewhere, a trumpet blared, Aaron, no doubt, pulling it from his case to add his own soundtrack. And still I waited. Each pair of headlights, each new arrival, I searched. I imagined her reaction, the surprise, the disbelief, maybe even the tears. I prayed for it, prayed that when she saw what had been built, she would see me differently. Because this wasn't just a party, it was a message. A message written in borrowed chairs and glowing bulbs, in jars of flowers and the hum of a borrowed generator. A message that said, "I may not fit in your photograph, but I can still give you something worth remembering." The night stretched on, the field swelling with life. And somewhere out there, my daughter was still at the gym, unaware that her world was about to tilt. I waited, heart pounding with every approaching car, certain that the moment was coming, the moment she would arrive and everything would change. Back at the school gymnasium, the air was thick with heat and perfume. The DJ shouted over the music, lights flashing in frantic colors. It looked like celebration, but beneath the sparkle there was fatigue. The gym floor groaned under the shuffle of shoes, and the decorations, streamers and balloons, already drooped with the weight of sweat and time. My daughter stood near the bleachers, clutching her clutch bag, smiling when someone looked, frowning when no one did. She had danced once, maybe twice, but mostly she lingered at the edge, pretending the music thrilled her. Truth was, it didn't. None of it did. The laughter was too forced, the photos too staged. And though she didn't admit it, a tiny voice inside whispered that something was missing. It was then that Aaron appeared, trumpet case slung over his shoulder, his tux jacket unbuttoned. He leaned down to her ear, voice pitched above the bass. "There's something happening," he said. She raised a brow. "Here." "Not here," he grinned. "Somewhere better." She laughed, brushing it off, but his grin stayed steady. "Trust me," he said. "You'll want to see it." She wasn't convinced at first. Prom was supposed to be here in the gym with the banners and the balloons. What would her friends say if she just left? Yet slowly she noticed the trickle, students slipping out, couples whispering, cars leaving the lot. And with each departure, the gym felt hollower, the music more like noise. One of her closest friends tugged her arm. "Come on, seriously, everyone's going." "Going where?" "You'll see." There was mischief in the answer, and curiosity has its own gravity. My daughter hesitated only a moment longer before she followed. They piled into cars, dresses gathered to keep from snagging, tuxedo sleeves rolled in the cuffs. Engines hummed. tires squealed softly against the pavement, and one by one the vehicles streamed out of the parking lot, heading down side roads, headlights piercing the dark. She rode in the backseat, peering out the window. The town blurred past, the diner glowing, the gas station empty, the streets hushed. Then the car turned onto a dirt road she didn't recognize. The tires jostled over gravel, and in the distance a strange glow appeared, faint at first, then growing. "What is that?" she asked. "You'll see," her friend repeated, grinning. The cars pulled up along the edge of the field. Music drifted from somewhere unseen, carried on the night breeze. She stepped out, clutched tight in her hand, and looked across the grass. And she froze. Strings of light shimmered above, casting a soft, golden hue over everything. Flowers lined the tables, their petals catching the glow. Chairs dotted the field in clusters, some already filled, others waiting. Teenagers danced in the open air, their gowns swishing, their laughter soaring, their shadows spinning across the grass. It was like walking into a dream. Her friends ran ahead, squealing, their heels sinking into the earth, but she lingered, stunned. She had never seen this place before, not like this. The field was alive, transformed. And at the edge of it all stood her father. He wasn't dressed in the tuxedo anymore. He wore only his shirt sleeves, rolled to the elbow, his hands still dusty from work. But he stood tall, watching the kids with an expression she couldn't place, part pride, part exhaustion, part something else entirely. Their eyes met across the glow. For a moment, the music, the laughter, the world itself seemed to fall away. Her breath caught. He didn't move toward her, not yet. He let her come to her own realization, let her see it with her own eyes. The jars of flowers, the chairs, the lights, all of it built not by professionals, but by a father who had no business trying to compete with a school dance, yet dared to anyway. Her chest tightened. She remembered the words she had thrown at him, the plea not to embarrass her, the shame she felt at his jacket, his camera. And here he was, standing in the middle of something more beautiful than the decorated gym could ever be. One of her friends nudged her. "See, told you." Then they ran off toward the music. But she stayed where she was, rooted, watching him. For the first time that night, she felt small, not in the way teenagers often feel, awkward and unseen, but small in the face of something larger than herself. Something she couldn't explain. She whispered to no one in particular, maybe just to the night air. "What did you do, Dad?" The wind carried her words, and though he didn't answer, the lights above flickered brighter, as if the field itself replied. She stepped farther into the field, the grass brushing her ankles, the sound of laughter swelling around her. Everywhere she looked, kids were smiling, dancing, breaking free from the stale air of the gymnasium. Couples twirled beneath the strings of light. A circle of friends shouted lyrics to a song they all knew. Even the shy ones had loosened, their feet tapping, their voices joining the night. It should have been overwhelming, but all she could see was her father. He stood near the food truck, wiping his hands with a rag, speaking to Marty in low tones. His hair, grayer than she remembered, caught the glow of the bulbs. He didn't notice her yet, or maybe he did, and he was pretending not to, giving her the space to take it all in. Her chest felt heavy. For weeks she had been wrapped in her own world, what dress to wear, what shoes matched, who might ask her to dance. Her father had been background noise, steady and unnoticed. But here, in this field, he was no background at all, he was the pulse of it. She walked closer, her heels sinking slightly into the soil. "Don't know how you pulled it off," she heard Marty say, "but you sure as hell did." Her father shrugged, voice low. "Just a little loan, nothing I can't handle." The words stopped her cold. "Alone." Marty lowered his voice, but she caught the fragments. "Risky, truck as collateral, interest's no joke." Her heart clenched. She suddenly saw the folding chairs, the rented speakers, the lanterns glowing like fireflies, and she realized they weren't free. Someone had paid for them, and that someone was the man standing with a rag in his hands, looking more tired than triumphant. Her stomach twisted. The shame she had felt at his tuxedo, at his camera, now turned sharp and cruel, but not toward him, toward herself. She stepped back, the music swelling as though to cover her retreat. Her friends didn't notice. They were lost in the joy of the night, their phones out, capturing videos of a secret prom they'd talk about for years. But she saw differently. She saw the lines under his eyes, the way he rubbed his hands as if even now he couldn't believe what he'd done. She saw the cost, not just the money, but the weight he carried to build this dream for her. And suddenly, the memory of that night in the living room returned like a knife. "Please don't. You'll embarrass me." She had thought those words vanished into the air, into the noise of youth. But words don't vanish. They sink, they scar. She saw it now in the way he stood a little apart from the crowd, not joining, only watching, as if reminding himself that this was not his party, not his moment. It was hers. She wandered to the edge of the field, her eyes stinging. A group of students ran past, laughing, one of them calling out, "Best night ever." She wanted to echo them, but the lump in her throat was too thick. She looked back at him again. He was moving now, picking up empty plates, refilling drinks, adjusting the strings of lights when one flickered. He was everywhere and nowhere, invisible in service. She realized that this had always been his place in her life, silent, unseen, building the stage so she could stand in the light. Tears welled. She brushed them away quickly, embarrassed, though no one was watching. She walked toward him at last. He turned, surprised, the rag still in his hand. For a moment neither spoke. The music swelled behind them, the crowd laughing, the field alive with celebration. But between them was only silence. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking. He waited. Why did you do all this?" He hesitated, then gave a small smile, weary but warm. "Because you deserve a night you'll never forget." Her throat closed. The words rushed up. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, I was wrong," but they tangled, caught between pride and regret. And then he reached out, just a light touch on her shoulder, the way he used to when she was small and scared of the dark. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "Just enjoy it, that's enough for me." But it wasn't enough for her, not anymore. She felt the tears break free, sliding hot against her skin. She turned her face away, but he saw them anyway, and instead of shame, his expression was only gentle. The music shifted to something slower. Couples paired off, the field turning into a waltz of shadows and light. She stood there, trembling, caught between the night's beauty and her own guilt. And for the first time she understood, this wasn't just a party, it was a sacrifice. And sacrifices, once seen, cannot be unseen. She stayed beside him longer than she expected, her friends already lost in the swirl of the music. The field pulsed with movement and sound, but her world had narrowed to the man standing a few feet away. His shirt sleeves rolled, his hands worn. For years she had tried to push him to the margins. Embarrassed by the roughness that clung to him, the grease beneath his nails, the thrift store jackets, the old truck that coughed when it started. Tonight, for the first time, she saw the same things differently. The calluses were proof of work, the jacket a shield against countless storms, the truck a vessel that had carried her to every practice, every game, every late-night pickup when no one else had shown. And here he was again, carrying her farther than she deserved. She wanted to tell him she was sorry. She wanted to collapse into his chest the way she had as a little girl, sobbing into the fabric of his shirt until she felt safe again. But there were eyes all around them, and pride, that old stubborn shadow, held her tongue. Instead, she let her hand brush his as she passed, the faintest gesture, and then she turned toward the crowd. Her friends spotted her instantly. "Finally!" one of them shouted, pulling her into a circle of dancers. The music thumped, and she let it move her, at first awkward, then freer. She laughed when someone spun her too fast, squealed when another tossed confetti into the air. The field glowed around them, the lights overhead swinging slightly in the night breeze. She danced, but she kept looking over her shoulder. Her father lingered near the edge, where the shadows were thicker, where he thought no one saw. He leaned against a post, sipping from a paper cup, his eyes never leaving the kids on the grass. For a moment she wondered if he realized he had built something extraordinary. To her friends, this wasn't just a second prom, it was the prom, the one they would tell stories about long after high school ended. They'd remember how the night began in a stale gymnasium and ended under stars, how a forgotten field turned into a kingdom. And yet he didn't look proud. He looked tired, content to watch but unwilling to step forward. She felt a pang then because she wanted him to step forward. When the music slowed, couples drew closer. She felt the urge to retreat, not because she was alone but because her chest was too full. She slipped away from the circle and wandered toward the food truck where Marty flipped burgers with a grin. "Best crowd I've seen in years," he told her, handing her a plate without her asking. "Your dad's a stubborn man, but when he sets his mind to something," he shook his head, chuckling, "well, you can see for yourself." She nodded, but the lump in her throat kept her silent. She carried the plate back toward the edge and found him there, still watching. "You should eat," she said, offering it. He glanced at her, surprised. "Go on, you're the guest tonight." "So are you," she whispered. For the briefest moment his eyes softened. He took the plate, not for hunger but for her sake, and together they stood, shoulder to shoulder, watching the crowd. As the night deepened, the field grew wilder. Someone started a line dance, another pulled out sparklers. Laughter rose and fell like waves. Teachers would shake their heads if they saw. Parents would worry about grass stains and late curfews, but for the kids who were there, it was freedom. She spun again with her friends, but now her laughter felt different. It wasn't just release, it was gratitude pouring out in each step, each clap, each shout to the sky. And though she didn't speak the words aloud, she carried them with her. "Thank you, Dad, thank you." Every so often her eyes found him. He stayed at the edge, fixing a light when it sagged, refilling the cooler when it emptied, wiping down a table when plates piled too high. He never joined the dance, but she realized he didn't need to. His joy was in building the space, not claiming it. Near midnight, when the music dipped again, Aaron lifted his trumpet and began to play. The notes floated over the field, slow and sweet, filling the air with something that wasn't canned from a speaker but alive, trembling, human. Couples swayed, friends linked arms, and for the first time in hours, silence spread, not absence of sound, but the reverence of it. She found herself standing still, her heart thudding to the rhythm of the horn. She looked toward her father again, and this time he met her gaze fully. No smile, no nod, just a steady connection that seemed to say, "This is for you." And she understood then, more than ever, the price of it all, not the dollars and cents, not even the loan he had signed, but the years of steady, unseen love that had built to this one night. Her eyes blurred. She blinked hard, but the tears fell anyway. This time, she didn't turn away. The trumpet faded into the night, the final note hanging like a ribbon in the air. For a moment, no one moved. The field was still, every face lifted toward the sound that lingered. Then, almost as if the stars themselves had decided it was time, the applause burst forth, cheers, whistles, clapping hands pounding the air. Aaron lowered his horn, bowing theatrically, and the crowd roared. But their eyes shifted quickly upward toward something new. The lights. Benny had been working quietly all evening, stringing one last line above the far end of the field. At that exact moment, as if waiting for the trumpet to fall silent, he flipped the switch. A cascade of bulbs lit up, brighter, wider, stretching across the grass like a net of golden fireflies. The field gasped in unison. And then came the sparklers. A handful of students had brought them, cheap packets from a gas station, and someone lit the first. Soon dozens flared to life, bright sticks of fire cutting through the night. They raised them high, waving, their laughter carrying across the field. It was chaos and wonder all at once. The music swelled again, the lights glowed fuller, the sparklers cracked and hissed, and suddenly the place didn't feel like a makeshift prom, it felt like the center of the universe. She stood in the middle of it, her dress shimmering with each flicker. And for the first time she forgot to care how she looked, forgot to measure herself against the other girls. She just felt it, the weight of a night too extraordinary to be real. But reality pressed in anyway. Her gaze drifted back to him, her father. He stood apart, as always, near the edge where the shadows lived. The sparklers reflected in his eyes, the glow softening the lines of his face. He wasn't holding a light of his own. His hands were empty, folded loosely, as though the joy belonged to them and not to him. Something broke inside her then. The crowd spun and shouted, but she felt a hush within. The field could have been silent for all she knew, because in that moment the only thing she heard was the echo of her own voice, words she wished she could pull back, words she had given him like a wound. "Please don't. You'll embarrass me." She had meant them in a whisper, but tonight they roared in her memory. And here was the man she had tried to hide, the man she had pushed aside, giving her the most beautiful night she had ever known. Her throat tightened, her eyes blurred again, tears spilling fast now, not delicate but raw. She turned, pressing through the crowd, her steps quick, her heels catching in the grass. A few friends called after her, confused, but she didn't answer. She moved faster, past the sparklers, past the music, past the laughter, until she reached him. He saw her coming. He straightened slightly, as though unsure whether to smile or step away. But before he could do either, she collapsed against him. The tears came hard, harder than she meant, soaking into his shirt. She clutched him like she had as a child, holding on as if he were the only thing steady in a spinning world. Her body shook and she couldn't stop the words. "I'm sorry, Dad," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." For a moment he didn't speak. His hand hovered, then settled gently on the back of her head. He breathed slowly, steadying her with the calm he always carried, the calm she had once mistaken for smallness. "You don't have to be sorry," he said softly. "Yes, I do." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes swollen with tears. "I was awful to you. I said things. I didn't mean them, Dad. I didn't, and you did all this. You," her voice cracked, the sentence breaking under its own weight. He shook his head. "I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because you're my daughter. That's all the reason I've ever needed." The words undid her. She buried her face against him again, the sobs coming in waves. Around them the music still played, the sparklers still shone, but in the circle of his arms none of it mattered. When she finally stilled, when her breathing slowed, she felt his chin rest lightly on her hair. His voice was steady, almost a whisper. "Do you know what I see tonight?" he asked. She shook her head. "I see the little girl who used to stand on my shoes to dance. I see the one who begged me to stay 5 more minutes at bedtime, the one who thought I could fix anything. That's who I still see, always." Her tears welled again, softer this time. "Even when she couldn't finish." "Even then," he said. And in that moment, beneath the glow of lights he had strung, with the debt he had taken hidden in his pocket, she finally understood. This wasn't about prom. It was never about sparklers or speakers or borrowed chairs. It was about love, the kind that doesn't ask for photographs or recognition, the kind that builds a night in a forgotten field just to remind you that you are cherished. Her arms tightened around him, not as apology now, but as promise. She would remember, and she would never ever forget. When the music rose again, she lingered in her father's arms a moment longer before he nudged her gently toward the field. "Go," he said, his voice soft but certain. "This is your night." She wiped her cheeks and nodded, though her legs felt heavy. The crowd seemed louder now, brighter, almost overwhelming after the quiet pocket they had shared. But she stepped back into it, her friends pulling her instantly into their circle, their laughter unbroken, their voices lifting in song. She tried to match them, tried to move with the same carefree rhythm. Yet everything felt different. The lights, the sparklers, the music. What had seemed magical only minutes ago now carried weight. Each glow reminded her of the hands that strung them. Each beat of music echoed the cost her father had shouldered. Still, she danced. She danced because he wanted her to, because to deny the gift would wound him more than her apology had healed. Her friends noticed the change in her, though they didn't understand it. "You're glowing tonight," one whispered. Another teased, "Finally loosening up, huh?" She smiled through it, but the glow they saw wasn't from the field. It was from the ache inside her, the ache that had shifted into something new, gratitude, fierce and unshakable. Across the grass, her father moved quietly between tasks. When the cooler ran low, he carried ice. When a chair broke, he replaced it. When the generator sputtered, he tapped it back to life. Most kids never noticed, their attention caught in the whirl of their own joy. But she noticed. Always her eyes found him, and with each glance her heart swelled until she thought it might break all over again. The trumpet began another song, a faster tune this time, and the crowd surged with it. Students linked arms, kicking and stomping in wild rhythm. A boy tripped, a girl shrieked with laughter, and the field shook with a joy no gymnasium could have held. Even Marty leaned out of his truck, spatula raised like a conductor's baton. "This," he bellowed over the music, "is living." The kids cheered in reply, voices echoing into the night. As she spun among them, her dress fanning like a dark wave, she felt something shift. For the first time all evening, she wasn't watching herself, wasn't checking her hair, her shoes, her posture. She wasn't wondering what the others thought. She was simply there, present in the wild current of laughter and light. It felt like freedom. And then, as the song ended and the cheer rose, she glanced again toward her father. He was sitting now, finally resting, his elbows on his knees. The fatigue showed clear in his shoulders, the slump of a man who had given more than he had to give. But his eyes, those eyes, were still bright, still fixed on her. It struck her then with sharp clarity. He didn't need to be in the crowd, didn't need the sparklers or the music. His celebration was in watching her. His joy was in her joy. And she couldn't bear the thought that he might leave this night unseen, unacknowledged, fading into the background the way he had for so many years. She excused herself from her friends and walked back across the grass. He looked up surprised. "Tired already?" He teased, his smile faint. She shook her head. "Come dance." He laughed low and uncertain. "Sweetheart, I haven't danced in years." "So," she pressed, "neither have half the people out there. They're not good at it either, but they're trying." He hesitated, his hand rubbing at the back of his neck. She saw the doubt, the old worry of embarrassing her again. The memory of her words still hung between them, fragile. She reached for his hand. "Dad, please." Something in her voice, maybe the softness, maybe the pleading, broke through. He stood slowly, his joints stiff, his breath heavy. And then, with the awkwardness of a man out of practice, he let her lead him toward the circle of light. The music started again, a song louder, faster than he could manage. The kids cheered at the sight of him stepping onto the field, some clapping, others laughing with delight. And for a moment he froze, the old fear rising. But she tightened her grip. "Just follow me." So he did. Step by clumsy step he moved with her, letting her guide him, letting the rhythm carry what his body could not. And though his movements were stiff, though his timing faltered, the kids cheered louder, surrounding them, chanting, "Go, Mr. Flores! Go, Mr. Flores!" His face reddened, but his eyes lit up, and for the first time that night, he laughed, really laughed, the sound booming above the music. And she laughed with him, the shame gone, replaced by pride so strong she felt dizzy with it. The field, the lights, the crowd, it all blurred. There was only the two of them, a father and daughter, awkward and unsteady, but together in the very heart of the night he had built. The cheering still echoed as the music wound down. He had slipped away again, back toward the edge of the field, pretending to busy himself with adjusting a light or checking the cooler. But the kids hadn't missed him. Their chants, his name shouted with laughter and affection, still buzzed in the air like the hum of bees. She stood among her friends, flushed from dancing, her heart racing with more than just movement. They were still laughing, still pointing. "Your dad's awesome," one said, shaking his head. "Seriously," another chimed in, "who even thinks to do something like this? It's like legendary." "Yeah," a third added, "we'll be telling people about this forever. Remember that year when some dad made the best prom in town? That's your dad." The words landed heavy, not mocking, not pitying, admiring. She felt heat rise to her face, not from shame this time, but from the sting of truth. For weeks she had dreaded that exact phrase, "that's your dad," because she thought it meant judgment, eyes rolling at his worn clothes, his tired truck, his life that didn't glitter. But here tonight it meant something else entirely. Her friends weren't laughing at him, they were looking at him with respect. And she realized she had never seen him that way herself. They wandered toward the food tables and she overheard more voices. "Look at the setup," one boy said. "This isn't school money. Somebody actually worked for this." "Mr. Flores did," a girl replied knowingly. "My cousin told me. He pulled it together in like 3 days. Who even does that?" Another shook his head in awe. "That's what I call love. Nobody's dad cares like that." The word love pierced her. She bit down hard, blinking against the tears rising again. She glanced over and saw him, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag, laughing at something Marty said, his shoulders heavy but his eyes alight. To them, he was the man who had created a miracle in a forgotten field. To her, he was still the man she had once dismissed as embarrassing. Her chest ached. As the night deepened, more kids gathered around him. They teased him about his clumsy dance, asked him questions, thanked him. He didn't puff up, didn't bask in the attention. He just shrugged and grinned, brushing it aside as though it were nothing. But it wasn't nothing. She could see it in their faces, the way they looked at him like he was larger than life. One boy handed him a soda. "You're the man, Mr. Flores." "Thanks for saving prom," another said, raising a cup in salute. He chuckled, embarrassed. "Don't give me too much credit, all I did was set up a few lights." But they didn't believe that, and neither did she. She stood a little apart, watching it unfold, her heart torn between pride and guilt. Pride because for the first time she saw the truth everyone else saw. Her father was remarkable. Guilt because she had been the last to see it. She remembered every moment she'd wished he were different, sharper clothes, smoother words, a life that fit the mold of her friend's parents. She remembered how she had hidden him in conversations, changing the subject, downplaying his work, laughing nervously when others asked about him. And now those same friends stood in a field, praising him, raising their cups to him, calling him the man of the night. Her hands trembled. She thought of the loan, of his truck offered up as collateral, of the risk he carried silently on his shoulders just to build this moment. He hadn't told her, he hadn't asked for thanks. He had just done it quietly the way he had always done everything, and she had nearly let it go unnoticed. The music swelled again, pulling the crowd back to the grass. She followed, but her steps were slower. She danced when they pulled her into the circle, smiled when they spun her, but her eyes kept drifting toward the man at the edge, the man who seemed content with shadows. She wanted to run to him again, to tell him everything that was breaking inside her, the pride, the regret, the love. But the words felt too fragile, too clumsy. They could never carry the weight of what she had discovered tonight. So she let her movements speak instead. She danced harder, laughed louder, lived fuller, not for herself but for him, because she knew he was watching. And each time her eyes found his, she saw the same steady gaze, the same quiet joy. But now she understood it, and that understanding was the most precious gift of all. By the time the clock edged toward midnight, the field had softened. The sparklers were gone, leaving only the warm glow of the bulbs above. The laughter of earlier had quieted into smaller clusters, couples sitting on the grass, friends lying on blankets, the music humming low in the background. She stood at the edge of her circle of friends, no longer swaying with them, her gaze fixed on the man who had built the night. He was sitting on one of the folding chairs now, his shoulders heavy, his head tilted back as if listening to the music more than watching it. His rag rested in his lap, forgotten. Something inside her cracked. The pride of the evening, the laughter, even the relief of forgiveness, it all tumbled into a single ache she could no longer carry in silence. She excused herself from her friends and walked toward him, her heels sinking in the damp grass, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached him, he stirred, surprised. "Everything all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her eyes were wet. "Can we talk?" He motioned to the chair beside him. She sat, hands twisting in her lap. For a moment neither spoke. The quiet between them was filled with the sound of distant chatter and the soft hum of the generator. Then she said it, voice trembling, "I hurt you." He blinked, startled. "Sweetheart, no," she cut in, shaking her head. "Don't tell me it didn't matter. I saw your face that night when I said you embarrassed me. I'll never forget it. I've been carrying it with me, and it's heavier than I thought it could be." Her throat tightened. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "You didn't deserve that, not after everything you've done for me." He looked down at his hands, silent for a moment. "You were just being a kid," he said softly. "They all go through that stage, wanting to stand on their own, afraid their parents will make them look small. But I made you small," she whispered. "And I can't stand it, not after tonight, not after seeing what you did, what you risked." His eyes flickered, the faintest crease of worry. "You heard about that?" She nodded. "The loan, the truck. Dad, why would you do that for one night?" He leaned back, exhaling slowly. His voice was low when he answered. "Because one night matters, maybe more than you realize. You'll have other dances, other parties, but this one you'll carry with you when you're older, when life isn't so simple anymore. And I wanted you to look back and know you were loved beyond reason." Her tears slipped free, hot and unrelenting. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "You don't have to prove you love me. I know you do. I just—" Her words broke, caught on a sob. "I don't know why I treated you the way I did. I think I was afraid of how people would see me if they saw you. And now I realize how blind I was, because everyone here sees you as someone incredible, and I was the only one too foolish to see it." He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "You're not foolish. You're young. And sometimes young people get lost in the noise of what they think matters. It doesn't make your heart bad. It just means you've got more to learn, and you're learning now." She shook her head, pressing her lips together. "I don't want to learn at your expense." His smile was gentle, almost weary. "That's what being a parent is. You pay a little of yourself so your kid can grow. I've been doing it since the day you were born. I'll do it as long as I can." Her chest ached, torn between pride and sorrow. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. The fabric of his shirt smelled faintly of sweat and soap, familiar and grounding. "I love you, Dad," she whispered. His arm wrapped around her, pulling her close. "I never doubted it," he murmured. And for the first time all night the weight lifted, not because the debt was gone, not because the sacrifices had disappeared, but because the space between them had closed. In the glow of the bulbs, among the laughter and whispers of teenagers scattered across the field, a father and daughter sat together, no shame, no distance. Only truth, raw and unshaken. And it was enough. The night had grown hushed. The music still played, but softer now, more like a soundtrack than a centerpiece. The kids were spread across the field, some still swaying in couples, others sprawled on blankets, voices dipping into the quieter tones of late evening. The frenzy had ebbed, leaving behind a kind of glow, gentle and enduring. She still sat beside her father, her head against his shoulder, her hand gripping his. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, as though he had finally allowed himself to rest. For a long while they stayed that way, watching the light sway slightly above them. But her heart hadn't settled, not yet. "Dad," she said at last, her voice low. He hummed in reply, his eyes still fixed on the field. "I need to know all of it. What did this really cost you?" He hesitated, the silence stretching. She felt him shift slightly as though weighing whether to answer. "I heard pieces," she pressed on, "but I want the truth, please, I need to hear it from you." His sigh was long, a sound carved from both fatigue and honesty. He rubbed his palms together, then spoke quietly, almost as if he were confessing. "It wasn't easy. I didn't have the money sitting around, you know that, so I went to the bank, put the truck up, signed papers I probably shouldn't have, told them it was for family needs." He chuckled without humor. "Guess they didn't imagine it meant lanterns and folding chairs." Her throat tightened. "And if you can't pay it back, then I lose the truck, and I find another way to work, that's the risk." She pulled back, staring at him with wide, wet eyes. "Why would you risk that much for one night for me?" He finally turned to meet her gaze, his expression steady. "Because you'll remember this night for the rest of your life. And one day when you're older, when you've built your own life, maybe you'll hit a moment where you wonder if you mattered enough, if someone ever fought for you without counting the cost, and I want you to be able to look back and know the answer. Yes, you mattered that much." Her tears spilled freely now, sliding down her cheeks unchecked. "I don't deserve you," she whispered. He smiled faintly, brushing a tear with his thumb. "You don't have to deserve me, you're my daughter, that's enough." She broke then, leaning into him, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, with a force that startled even her. She clung to him, sobbing into the crook of his neck, every ounce of pride shattered, every wall gone. "I love you," she said again, the words muffled by tears. "I love you so much. I promise I'll never," she stopped, choking on the words. "I'll never be ashamed of you again." His arms folded around her, firm and grounding. "SHH," he soothed, rocking her slightly as if she were small again. "Don't promise anything, just be here with me. That's all I ask." But she shook her head, pulling back just enough to look at him. "No, I need to promise, because I was blind before, and now I see. You're the best man I've ever known, and I don't care if anyone else agrees. I do, I see you, and I'm proud." The words cracked his composure. For the first time all night, his eyes glistened. He tried to blink it away, but she saw, and she held him tighter. Around them the field went on, laughter, whispers, music drifting, but in that moment, it was just the two of them, a father and daughter clinging to each other as though the world could vanish and it wouldn't matter. Eventually her sobs softened, her breaths coming steadier. She stayed wrapped in his arms, her cheek resting against the warmth of his chest. "You gave me the night of my life," she whispered. He chuckled softly, kissing the top of her head. "No, you gave it to me. Watching you out there, smiling again, that's my gift." She smiled through her tears, shaking her head. "Then maybe it's both of ours." He leaned his forehead against hers, their eyes closing in the stillness. The lights swayed above, the night air cool around them, but within their embrace was a warmth that needed no lanterns, no sparklers, no borrowed field. It was love, laid bare, unmeasured and unafraid. And it was enough to carry them both. The hour grew late, and the field began to thin. Parents started pulling up in quiet caravans, headlights sweeping across the grass, calling out names from rolled-down windows. Some kids lingered, reluctant to let go, clinging to the last songs and the final laughter, but even magic has its curfew. She stayed close to her father now, though she still moved with her friends, hugging them, exchanging promises that they would never forget this night. Their voices rang with certainty. "Best prom ever. This will be in stories forever. Your dad's a legend." The words filled her with pride, but they also pressed something heavier into her chest. Pride and sorrow mixed uneasily, the way salt sharpens sweetness. She stole glances at him. He smiled when they called out, nodded when they waved goodbye, but the smile was thinner now, his shoulders sagging deeper. Each step seemed slower, his hand lingering longer on his knee when he bent to gather stray cups or fold a chair. The exhaustion was no longer hidden. It trailed him like a shadow. When the music finally faded, when the last spark of laughter floated into the night, the field fell quiet. The bulbs still glowed overhead, but they seemed softer now, tired themselves. She walked to him as he stacked chairs, one on top of another. "Dad, stop," she said gently. "Almost done," he replied, his voice gruff with weariness. "You've done enough." He paused, looking at her as though weighing her words. Then he set the chair down, slow, deliberate. He leaned on it a moment, catching his breath. She stepped closer, laying a hand on his arm. "You're exhausted." He chuckled faintly. "You don't build a night like this without paying for it." The sentence hit her harder than she expected, paying for it. She knew he meant the sore muscles, the tired bones, but she also knew there was more, the loan, the truck, the debt waiting like a shadow beyond tonight. And suddenly the field felt different. The magic hadn't vanished, but it was tinged now with a whisper of regret, not for what had been built, but for what it had cost. She took the rag from his hand and tossed it onto the table. "Sit down," she insisted. He obeyed, lowering himself into a folding chair with a sigh that carried more years than he would admit. She sat beside him, her hand finding his again. "Promise me something," she said. He looked at her, wary but listening. "Promise me you won't carry this alone. The loan, the truck, all of it. You've carried enough for me already." He shook his head gently. "It's not your burden." "But it is," she pressed, "because it was for me, and I can't let you keep sacrificing everything while I pretend it's free." Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze. "I want to help however I can. I don't care if it's picking up extra hours after school or finding ways to save. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." He studied her, eyes softening. "You're still young. Your only job is to grow, to live." She swallowed hard. "And what if living means standing with you? What if it means not letting you stand alone anymore?" The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the generator. Then slowly his expression shifted. Not surrender, not even agreement, but a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Pride, yes, respect too. "You're growing up," he said quietly. She squeezed his hand. "Maybe, but I don't ever want to grow so much that I forget you." The headlights of the last car swept across the field, carrying the final group of kids home. The field was empty now, just the two of them beneath the dim bulbs. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder once more. His breathing was heavy but steady. She could feel the weight of his body pressing into the chair, could hear the quiet crackle of fatigue in his chest. And though she hated to admit it, she felt a pang of fear. That one day his body would no longer carry these burdens. That one day his chair would sit empty no matter how many lights they strung above it. Her arms tightened around his. "Don't leave me, Dad," she whispered, not meaning the night, not meaning the field. His hand patted hers gently. "Not tonight," he said. She closed her eyes, clinging to those words. The field smelled of trampled grass and fading flowers, of smoke and sweat and something else she couldn't name, a mixture of joy and loss, of victory and debt. The night had been perfect and yet imperfect, and maybe that was what made it real. For every spark of magic there is always a cost. She knew that now. And as she sat beside him, her hand locked in his, she promised herself that she would spend her life trying to repay it, not in money, not in loans, but in love. Because love was the only currency that mattered. By Sunday morning, the town already knew. It began with the glow of phone screens. The kids who had been there, hair still smelling of smoke, shoes stained with grass, couldn't stop posting. Pictures of the lights strung over the field, videos of the trumpet cutting through the night, clips of sparklers raised like torches against the sky. Captions were short, almost reverent. "Best night ever. Real prom happened here. Thanks, Mr. Flores." She scrolled through them on her bed, her dress still draped over the chair, faint creases where it had bent beneath her knees. Every swipe brought a fresh rush of images, her classmates laughing, couples dancing, arms thrown around each other in joy. And there in nearly every frame was her father, sometimes in the background holding a chair, sometimes at the edge of the light, a tired smile on his face, sometimes caught in motion, awkwardly dancing beside her as the kids cheered. Her friends weren't mocking him, they weren't embarrassed, they were celebrating him. One post stopped her cold, a simple picture of the field empty now, the bulbs still hanging above like fallen stars. The caption read, "A father built this for his daughter, and it was better than anything money could buy." Her eyes blurred. She pressed the phone to her chest and let the tears fall, silent and grateful. At church that morning, whispers floated before the sermon even began. Parents leaned across pews asking, "Did you hear what happened Friday night?" Some wore amusement, others disbelief, but all carried admiration. She sat beside her father, her hand brushing his. He bowed his head as the hymns rose, as if nothing had changed. But she saw the nods, the smiles, the pats on his back as they left. He deflected them with humility, murmuring, "Just wanted the kids to have a good time." But she knew better. By Monday, the story spread beyond the town. A cousin posted a video that caught fire, picked up by strangers who had never heard of their small place. Comments flooded in. "This is what fatherhood looks like. I'd trade every fancy dance for a night like this." Protect this man at all costs. She read them aloud to him as he fixed the screen door that stuck in the morning humidity. He chuckled, shaking his head. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. But she saw the way his eyes softened, the way he paused just a second longer before returning to the hinge. Her classmates couldn't stop talking about it at school. Your dad's a legend. Seriously, can he adopt me? Best prom ever, hands down. She smiled at their words, pride swelling, but beneath it lingered guilt. She had once dreaded their attention, afraid they'd see him as less. Now, when they saw him as more, she couldn't escape the truth. She had been the only one who hadn't. Still, she carried their admiration like a banner. When someone asked if she had been embarrassed, she lifted her chin and said, "No, not anymore." The words felt like freedom. That evening she sat with him on the porch. The sun sank low, painting the world in orange and rose. He sipped from a chipped mug, the steam curling upward. She turned her phone toward him, scrolling through the posts, the videos, the comments. "You've gone viral," she teased. He squinted at the screen, unimpressed. "All I see are kids with too much free time." She laughed, nudging him with her shoulder. "You don't get it, they love you, everyone does." He shrugged. "They'll forget soon enough, the world moves on." She tilted her head, studying him. "Maybe, but I won't." That made him pause. He set the mug down and looked at her, his eyes steady. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, the evening air cool in her lungs. "I mean this will stay with me forever. Not because it went online, not because people cheered, but because you showed me what love really looks like. Quiet, costly, unstoppable." For once he didn't deflect. He didn't laugh or shrug. He simply nodded, the faintest glimmer in his eyes. The porch fell quiet. Crickets sang in the grass, the air carrying the faint smell of earth cooling after a warm day. She leaned her head against his shoulder just as she had in the field. He let it rest there, his hand covering hers. And in that silence, she felt the truth settle deep inside her. This wasn't just her father's night or her own. It was a night that belonged to both of them, woven into memory, indelible and unbreakable. A night the world might forget, but they never would. Weeks passed, but the night never faded. The field eventually returned to its ordinary silence. The chairs went back to the rental company, the flowers wilted, the lights were boxed away. But in the memory of those who had been there, the glow remained. For her, it lived in every conversation that began with, "Remember prom night?" Her friends still laughed about the line dance, still posted old clips when they were bored, still teased her with pride, "That's your dad." And now she smiled when she heard it. Her father didn't change much after that night. He still woke early, still fixed things for neighbors, still came home tired but willing to do more. The loan lingered, the payments circled like birds overhead, but he never complained. If anything, he carried it lighter than she expected, as though the memory of what it bought him was worth the price. One evening she sat with him at the kitchen table, the checkbook open between them. She was learning now, balancing numbers, writing down expenses, asking questions she had once avoided. He showed her how to stretch dollars, how to plan ahead, how to carry responsibility without fear. "You don't need to do this," he told her gently. "I want to," she replied, "because I don't want to just be loved. I want to learn how to love back." He looked at her then, long and steady, pride and tenderness mingling in his eyes. Graduation came not long after. On that day, as she crossed the stage, she scanned the crowd until she found him. He wasn't in a tuxedo or anything polished, just his cleanest shirt, his hair combed carefully, his smile wide. When her name was called, he stood and clapped, louder than anyone else. And this time, when she posed for pictures, she pulled him in close, her arm wrapped tightly around him. No hesitation, no shame. Later, when they looked at the photo together, she whispered, "This is the picture I'll keep forever." Years later, she would tell the story often, to friends in college who asked about her hometown, to colleagues who wondered what shaped her, to her own children when they complained that she was old-fashioned or out of touch. She would tell them about the night her father built a dance under the stars, about the loan he shouldn't have taken, the truck he put at risk, the hours of labor no one paid for. She would tell them how she nearly missed it, how she nearly let shame blind her to the greatest gift of her life. And she would tell them the truth she carried ever since. Love isn't about appearances. Love is about presence. It's about showing up, even when it costs more than you think you can give. On a quiet evening, long after the world had moved on, she sat once more on the porch beside him. The air was cool, the crickets steady. She leaned into his shoulder and whispered, "I'll never forget." He smiled, the lines at his eyes deeper now, but his voice the same steady calm. "I didn't build that night for the world to remember," he said. "I built it for you." And she knew in her bones that was the kind of love that endures. Dear friends, thank you for listening to this story. If it touched you, if it reminded you of your own family, your father, your mother, or someone who sacrificed quietly for you, then carry that memory with pride. Share it, honor it, and most of all, live it. I create these stories to celebrate love, forgiveness, and the bonds that make us human. If you'd like to hear more, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. From my heart to yours, I wish you good health, happiness, and a family that always reminds you you are loved beyond measure. Until next time, take care.